Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you to the opening of the 12th Annual International Development Conference here at Harvard. My name is Ricardo Hausmann, and I'm the director of the Center for International Development. And since this is the Conference on International Development, they thought it would be appropriate for me to start it. But I feel that I'm kind of cheating here because this is really on an event that has been organized by the students. So this is cheap credit that I'm taking here. And I'm really, really delighted. This year's conference has been organized around the theme, Fulfilling the Development Promise, Transforming Ideas into Action. And I like that. I like the idea that the question is not just about diagnosing what the problems are and so on, but about actually going out there and doing the work. And that's what this school is about. That's what the development interest is about. So we're going to hear in the next day ideas on a whole range of issues, from economic progress, social progress, political stability, HIV/AIDS, and other of the major challenges that the developing countries are facing. Now, this is really an impressive achievement by the students that have organized this event. They have worked extremely hard to cover the major development challenges and to put together really an impressive program. There are students from the Kennedy School, the Harvard Business School, the School for Public Health, MIT, and the Fletcher School at Tufts. So this is a pretty wide community of students that we have here in this town that are interested in the development challenges that the world is facing. One of these students organizers is Mariam Usmanzia. Mariam has served as co-chair for the conference this year and focused especially on securing our exceptional keynote speaker. So I'm going to leave her the honor of presenting our keynote speaker, who actually comes from South Africa, which is the country where the Center for International Development right now is spending most of its energy thinking about the challenges in South Africa and thinking about the problems ahead. So I'm terribly excited with the fact that we have the South African flag here with us this afternoon. So Mariam, please introduce our guest.
Thank you, Professor Hausmann. The first time I heard Zaki speak, I was mesmerized by the honesty and integrity of his gaze. A deep-rooted passion and a brilliant mind combined with a sense of humor. There was no drama, no exaggerated gestures. This was just Zaki. He delivered his speech in direct, short sentences in a very matter-of-fact tone, and that alone was enough to move us all to the very fabric of our being. At the Kennedy School, we talk a lot about whether our career is our calling. If activism was ever a calling for a person, his name would be Zaki Ahmed. Born in Johannesburg, Zaki started his political life at the age of 14 as one of the leaders of the 1976 anti-apartheid school boycotts. Between 1976 and 1980, he was arrested, tried, and imprisoned at some point in each of those years. After his release in 1980, he built a series of NGOs providing educational support and skills training to disadvantaged youth. Zaki initiated the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality, and as its director, ensured retention of the clause prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation in the Bill of Rights. Due to his work there, the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality has been widely acclaimed as a model for NGO activism. As Zaki puts it, social activism and social justice is a way for him to sleep well at night. Since he has redefined the extent of impact that activism can have on reshaping social policies, I'm guessing he's a very sound sleeper. HIV/AIDS was never far from Zaki's agenda. He initiated work in this area through an NGO as early as 1989. After disclosing his own HIV-positive status, he turned in 1998 to do something about it. He started with a small public demonstration on the steps of St. George's Cathedral. Zaki later founded the Treatment Action Campaign, which since then has been built into the most vocal and visible lobby fighting for the rights of HIV-positive individuals and their right to treatment and non-discrimination in a developing country. The Treatment Action Campaign has notched up some real achievements: drastic reductions in the price of drugs for HIV-positive individuals, as well as placing treatment of HIV-positive individuals and the prevention of mother-to-child infections on the agenda of South African government. Zaki has publicly vowed not to take antiretroviral medication until it is available at an affordable price for everyone in South Africa. He is currently chairperson of the Treatment Action Campaign. It is an honor to have him as the opening keynote speaker for the International Development Conference, and a privilege for me to have this opportunity to present him to you today. Zaki Ahmed.
Good afternoon. You would have noticed my pink socks if you're sitting this side. And I say to people always that it's not a sign of my sexual orientation. It's my politics that it reflects. I want to say thank you to Professor Hausman, to Mariam, to the Center for International Development, and above all to the students. Harvard has a special place in, I wouldn't say in the politics of America, because that would be an understatement, but in HIV and AIDS treatment. It has that special place because of people like Jim Kim, Paul Farmer, and so on. It also has that special place because of its relationship to organizations like Physicians for Human Rights, Partners in Health, MSF. In fact, one of MSF's people who came to South Africa, Toby Casper, is here today. Harvard also, most importantly, through the Harvard Consensus Statement, I think it was in the year 2000, made it very clear to all of us and changed the way in which academic institutions and public health officials came to see HIV/AIDS treatment. And so you have an important place in the treatment of HIV and the prevention of HIV. So I want to say thank you for that. In going on, there are a number of things that I would like to address in action and in the type of action we need to deal with. And I'll speak obviously from my context, which is South Africa, but what I would ask people to do is to put themselves in the place of people in Ecuador, people in Nepal, people in China, Russia, and India, and think the developments through in those places as well. I want to quote W.H. Auden. He wrote about Freud, and he said, "When there are so many we shall have to mourn, when grief has been made so public and exposed to the critique of a whole epoch, the frailty of our conscience and anguish. Of whom shall we speak? For every day they die among us, those who were doing us some good, who knew it was never enough, but hoped to improve a little by living. I've told this story before, but I'm going to repeat it here because I think it's critical for us never to forget. On the 11th of September 2001, my colleague Sipho Mtati and I, she's the General Secretary of TAC, and she scares everyone, including me. She's probably the only person in TAC I'm scared of. She and I went to see the Archbishop of the Anglican Church, Archbishop Njongonkulu Ndungane. And we went to ask him to go and visit a 5-year-old called Sibongile Mazeka. And Sibongile had her aunt, Tembisa Constance Mshlongo, had asked TAC to organize her 5th birthday party because she had seen, the aunt had seen us on television, and Sibongile had asked her, why are you looking at those people singing on television? And she said, because they have HIV like you have. And critically for her, she said to her aunt, because her mum had died already, she said, please will you get them to organize my 5th birthday party because they sing nicely. And of course, our Guguletu branch organized her 5th birthday party, and it was reported in the Cape Times. On the 11th of September, before that, the critical thing to remember about her is that her aunt explained to us in an affidavit before the Constitutional Court, she explained that the worst thing for her was when Sibongile started losing her memory. The fact that in the last year of her life, she had to go to hospital 13 times, that her aunt had lost her job as a domestic worker because she had to take so much time off looking after her. And so on the 11th of September, we were sitting in the Archbishop's office, and there were 2 phone calls. One to us telling us that Sibongile had died, and one to the Archbishop telling him of the enormous tragedy and the terrible thing that had happened in the United States when 3,000 people were massacred through terrorist attacks. And I'm not one of those people who debate whether life lost is innocent or not innocent. For me, all life, and I believe for all of us, all life is valuable. And so that is a tragedy on an enormous scale. But on that day, 8,000 people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in poor countries throughout the world, died, like Sibongile. And how many people can remember the names of people other than Sibongile who died on that day from AIDS-related illnesses? The world has changed remarkably. But the most important challenge that we face, HIV comes to represent for humanity the most important challenge of leadership for the 21st century. The epidemic marks a global crisis of leadership based on a frailty of our conscience still today. The crisis of leadership is evidenced in the humanitarian emergency of HIV prevention, treatment, stigma, and discrimination. Now, what does that crisis of leadership represent? It represents a crisis of leadership that at every level, whether in civil society, in business, in international agencies, or at governmental level, our leaders fail to see that HIV is a deeply political question. And for the Treatment Action Campaign and for all my colleagues and comrades who work with us, we recognize that HIV/AIDS represent and is a tragic illustration of local and global, between the body and the body politic, at every level of society. Last week, this last week, the South African Medical Journal published an editorial by one of the best public health doctors in South Africa, Francois Venter. And he said, the failure of HIV prevention is South Africa's biggest health crisis. Now, I said that the failure of leadership is the failure to recognize that HIV is political. What do I mean by that? I mean, firstly, that most people do not see HIV as the greatest inequality between rich and poor, the greatest inequality between men and women, the power that men have over women, the greatest inequality between white and black, the greatest inequality between lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and heterosexual people. It relies on all those inequalities on a very large scale. And unless we face them, the inequalities between rich and poor countries, the enormous power that corporations have, if our leadership, whether in UNAIDS or in the White House here, fail to recognize that, then of course there's a moral crisis and an absence of dealing with the real problems of the epidemic. Now let's talk about the crisis of prevention in South Africa for a second. Most reliable studies, which the government rely on, show the following: that in 2004, we had 500,000 new HIV infections. There are 1,500 new infections every day. If that was simply the global crisis, it would already be a tragedy. But it's one country. And if we as activists and as academics and as researchers and as students and as international agencies and local activists, if we fail to recognize what can happen in China, where very often an HIV activist can disappear if they speak the truth, if we fail to recognize the connection between India that has provided the country with the cheapest medications, but its people still don't have access to those medications, if we fail to recognize that Brazil is struggling because it cannot afford third-line drugs, it's struggling with drug companies, if we fail to recognize that Russia could allow the engulfing of the whole of Europe with a generalized epidemic unless it seriously tackles its own epidemic, then we have a serious problem. And our leadership globally, and all of us, have the responsibility of looking at those countries in particular, because they are responsible for all the smaller countries and a range of other countries around them. They acted, unfortunately, at the moment, like Big Brother. In South Africa, we behave as if we the America of the world towards the rest of Africa. And I'm not talking about that sort of relationship, but a relationship of solidarity. Now, that is the generalized picture of the epidemic. But let's look at young women. There's no question that they're more affected than young men. A remarkable survey which looked at 15 to 24-year-olds done by Love Life and the Reproductive Health Research Unit at the University of Witwatersrand. They took 10,000 young people from across our country, tested them for HIV, looked at what the relationship was between their HIV status, their knowledge, and so on, showed the following. Women aged, in the age group 15 to 24, the total aggregate was 12%, 10 to 12% seropositivity. Women, young women in that age group had a seroprevalence of 15.5%. Young men, 4.8%. So you can see the enormous difference there. In the 15 to 19 age group, which means high school students, in the 15 to 19 age group, high school students, women had a 7.3% seroprevalence and young men 2.5. Now, for all of us, the most shocking thing about that survey was that way over 75% of youth thought they were not at risk for HIV infection. And among HIV-positive youth, because this was an epidemiological study, among HIV-positive youth, 62% of them thought that they were not at risk of HIV infection. So it shows that there's a serious problem with messaging, with understanding, with the social conditions, and so on. But HIV also represents a crisis of illness for individuals, for families, for healthcare services, and of course the economy. In 2000, our government was presented by one of their own health economists with a survey. And the survey said to them that they should expect a dramatic increase from 50,000 in 2000 to 150,000 hospital admissions, AIDS-related. There's no question today that figure was a low one. in the impact that HIV is having on the healthcare services, and not least in the area of tuberculosis, which is the indicator of how the epidemic has dramatically developed. And so I want to just use the figure of death. You can ask me more about the question, but let me quickly tell you a story. One of my closest friends was a law professor called Ronald Lowe, and I spent in his house 3 months a year while helping to do some TAC work in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And he was a remarkable man. He was a conscientious objector in the 80s. He was a teacher. I remember him saying to me one day, he taught at a school for kids who couldn't hear, and he said, "You know, I never taught such marvelous kids. They all remain quiet like you are." And he said to me, "You know what I discovered? They turned off their hearing aids whenever I came into the classroom." So that was the type of chap he was. He was on the committee that helped. He was on the committee that helped try bring to book the murderers of Gugu Dlamini, a woman who was stoned to death in Durban in 1998 December after she declared her HIV positive status. Ronald, last May, almost exactly 11 months ago, called me and said, "I have been diagnosed with AIDS and my mom has just died in the ward next to me." And he had a CD4 count of 8. And because he was in a private hospital and he was a white professor and a gay man, they said, "White gay man, PCP pneumonia." And for 8 weeks, he had had a terrible TB raging through his body. But the TB test he had could not detect that he had HIV. Today you can test, and he was tested with an HIV test that gave him a reliable result in 15 minutes. To get a reliable TB test, you have to wait for how long? 6 weeks, especially if you're HIV positive. And that is a critical question that scientists, public health officials, and all of us need to address. Ronald is dead today because there was no TB treatment. And so, for me, the burden of illness is just one of those critical problems that we have to address. I was telling Professor Hausman just as we came out, but just let me give you one other statistic. Of the HIV positive, of the TB positive people in Khayelitsha, where over 1,400 people have TB for every 100,000 people, which is 280 times the number of people who have TB in the United States. 74% of people with tuberculosis also have HIV. At the hospital that I attend on the border between Gugulethu and Manenberg, Jooste, for my HIV, 50 people die every month because of TB, HIV-related TB. Now, the crisis of mortality, everyone here will know that, of course, we have a skeptical and a president who is in very deep denial on HIV and AIDS. None more so than when he was presented with the Statistics South Africa report last year. And that report was made public 6 months afterwards, in February last year. The report showed the following, that in 1997, we had 260,000 natural deaths. By 2001, we had 401,000 natural deaths. Most critically, and this is the biggest tragedy for South Africa that is immeasurably better off today than it ever was under apartheid, that the people most affected by death today, still infants, 0 to 1. The number of deaths increased from 34,700 in 1997 to 48,000. And that's the only unreliable measure in the counting of 3 million death certificates, because children who die very often do not have birth certificates, and so they will not have death certificates. So that's the only unreliable number in that certificate. The biggest tragedy for all of us is also that the age profile changed completely. And that is borne out by the fact that in that same year, Gatsha Buthelezi, who I believe is South Africa's worst politician next to the old apartheid politicians. And it's a tragedy. He had the courage to publicly admit that his son and daughter died of HIV. And in the same year, President Mandela announced that his son had died of HIV. And his grandchildren had the courage to admit that both their son, their father and mother had died of HIV. So what the Stats South Africa report showed to all of us was that the age profile of death had changed completely. Instead of people dying in their 60s and 70s, the age group most affected by death were people in their 20s and people in their 30s. So, for instance, people 25 to 29, 18,000 in 97, up to 35,000. People in their 30 to 34 age set, 18,900, 39,000 in 2001, and 46,000 in 2002. That is the single largest group of people, whereas people in their 70s and 60s, the numbers were still in their 20,000s. What did our president have to say about this report? He said the following in his typically English way, understatement. Broad trends in mortality confirm the need for us to continue to pay particular attention to the health of our nation. Now, for me, this is a crisis that requires, and I think for every thinking person in South Africa and globally, this is something that should mobilize and spur everyone to action. For me, this report can be replicated at every level in India, in China, and so on, perhaps not on the scale of South Africa. And that is what we have to prevent, both in prevention, in treatment, and above all, in the education of people, of young people. And I'm not talking about AIDS education, I'm talking about formal schooling, university education, and so on, because we have to give young people a vision of their future. I want to end up by speaking about what we can do. I was going to talk to you about Hannah Arendt, but I won't do that now because of time. But I can just tell you that there's no cookbook, anarchist cookbook, to explain what we need to do. I know that I'm writing a denialist cookbook because I love cooking, and my favorite vegetables are spinach, garlic, ginger, and so on. So I'm going to cook for all of you one day. But the critical thing is that everyone here has a duty, to participate in a global social movement that affirms the principles that everyone has the right to life, dignity, equality, and freedom. And that none of us should be scared to affirm that every person has that right, because that is the only basis on which we can deal with the epidemic. I want to suggest that to all of you that a very critical text to guide all of us, because there's nothing that will guide us, but really read Adam Hochschild's new book. The old book was brilliant. This one is just as good, if not better. It's called Bury the Chains. And in it he speaks of the abolitionist movement in Britain, the movement to abolish the slave trade in Britain, where they managed to unite workers, students, business people, above all if I wasn't an atheist, I'd be a Quaker. Quakers, critically, for all of us society ladies like myself, all of us, they managed to unite everyone. And for those of you who are students who worry that sometimes your papers are motivated by self-interest, think of this. There was a young chap called Thomas Clarkson who, on his way from Oxford to London, thought of earning some money by writing a speech to a paper that was going to earn him some credibility. And he wrote a paper and became one of the greatest organizers in the movement to abolish the slave trade. So, for me, what are the tools that we need? First is a practical morality, a morality that affirms what I spoke about in terms of everyone has the right to life, dignity, and freedom, and so on. The second is that there are 6 points that I would recommend we all look at, like equal access and the freedom that everyone has, the principles, the practical morality of that, creating a moral consensus out of that. The second is, and we cannot undermine it in any way, is that the demands, not the needs, not simply the needs, the demands and the needs of women and girls need to be prioritized because of inequality in every society that undermines the rights to autonomy, equality of women, and autonomy and equality of women. Why do I say that? Not simply because it's a nice thing to say, but our organization in Khayelitsha and across the Western Cape spent 2 years trying to bring to justice 3 men and 1 woman who murdered one of our activists, Lorna Mlofana. And the men first raped her, and when they discovered she had HIV, they killed her, and a woman joined them. And the critical thing is that literally within a week after they had been sentenced, another one of our activists was raped and killed. And this is part of a very broad trend of violence against women in South Africa and globally. And it's important that all of us look at the questions of why women are the victims of violence, but also why do young men do this? So that would be the second thing. The third thing is that every effort we do on prevention and treatment needs to be human rights based, but it also needs a scientific evidence base. And our social research needs to be ethical. But the reason I make that point is I was saying to some of the people earlier today, is we need a scientific advocacy that is capable of explaining in simple English to George Bush that the smallest virus that is sexually transmitted, hepatitis B, cannot go through a latex condom. And that the report that has just come out to discuss PEPFAR from the Congressional Office mistakes the issue. It's not the confusion in relation to PEPFAR money, it's the wrong policy of encouraging abstinence only, be faithful only, and so on. How do you say to a young girl who wants to look like Alicia Keys, who wants to look like these beautiful Harvard young women, and I'm straight so I can say that. No, sorry, I'm gay. What? That was a bad slip. That was a very bad slip. What do you say to a young woman who wants to look like Alicia Keys and who needs school fees and who does not have social security and whose parents are unemployed? What do you say to a young man who is 31 years old, not so young anymore, who has never had a job in his life, who has 2 children and has to live with his parents and then tell them he has HIV? In that context, how do you encourage abstain, be faithful, and condomize? Simply, ABC, the problem of prevention, it's a huge mistake. ABC is. The fourth dimension is we need a context-specific prioritization of the most vulnerable and most marginalized in each of our societies where we have an epidemic. In some places, it will be sex workers. In other places, it's going to be intravenous drug users. In other places, it's going to be migrant laborers. In most places, it will be women, young men, and children. So it's critical for us to know that in every context, the most vulnerable and most marginal groups are going to be different. But we have to affirm a scientific and a human rights approach to all of them. And for me, the fifth question of every person having the duty and the right to protect themselves from harm and to protect others from harm by having access, equal access, to the means in which to protect themselves is a critical one. Every individual also has a responsibility, and we shouldn't shy away from discussing our individual responsibility even as we recognize the structural problems and the structural inequalities. The last question is that every government, every international agency, every civil society has to be held accountable through national, through regional, and through international legal instruments for what is happening in the world. Because otherwise we face a Holocaust against poor people. For me, the only guarantee of all this, is organization. An organization of the communities most affected, but even organization here at Harvard. The organization I would appeal to you to have at Harvard is each of you to do the research you can do. For Harvard, who licenses many medical products, whether for breast cancer or for any illness, to sign agreements that every person should have access to it, every public health program should be able to have access to it, not simply in poor countries, but here too. Because the biggest struggle that all of us face, including us in South Africa, is to ensure that the United States has a public health program and national health insurance. Because that's going to ensure that people globally also have it. So I want to finish up on saying that there's an enormously great group of people here in Boston. So I want to say to you, organize, do your research, do your studying, put pressure on the Harvard administration, appeal to their good conscience, I believe they have it, create a moral statement, another consensus statement on access to intellectual property rights at Harvard University. You don't simply need to do it for Harvard, because if Harvard does it, everyone else will follow. And so I would appeal to you for that. And lastly, I want to say a special thanks to two organizations here. One is the Student Global AIDS Campaign and its Harvard's chapter, and the South African Development Fund, which continues the best tradition of the old anti-apartheid movement, because not simply of their support for TAC, but for their support for campaigns for access to housing, education, a range of things in South Africa. So a special thanks to them, and I know I'm going to get them in trouble with our president again, but let me say that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Zaki. That was a very impressive speech. Well, now we have an opportunity to grill Zaki Ahmad with questions and comments. There are 4 microphones. Please approach the microphone, present yourself, try to keep it brief, and maybe with a question mark.
Okay. My name is Brooke Baker. I'm a law professor at Northeastern and a fellow activist with Zaki. My question is about the current negotiations between the U.S. and the South African Customs Union, and whether you could address that.
The biggest tragedy about, thanks Brooke, and Brooke's done some fantastic work. The biggest tragedy for all of us about Doha is that the United States has undermined every gain we've made at Doha by going into bilateral negotiations at a regional level and at country level. I believe in South Africa, they are putting enormous pressure, not simply on the South African government, who's objecting to that pressure, and I think has the power to resist it, but on the smaller countries like Lesotho, Botswana, Swaziland, and so on. And I think I'm sure we're going to resist it. And if our government signs an agreement that takes away what we won at Doha, and more importantly, that takes away from the right to life, to healthcare access, and so on, we'll see it in court.
Let me go over there.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Radin, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to first quickly say a brief word of thanks. I was working in South Africa, working with township community-based organizations engaged in addressing the AIDS crisis. And when I arrived in 2002, about 40% of my colleagues my age were HIV positive. None of them were receiving antiretrovirals, and today all of them are. And I think that that's thanks in no small part to your work, to the work of TAC, and to activists like you that you've inspired. So thank you for having a profound impact on some people who are important to me. I'll move to my question quickly. My question is about, you're talking about organizing people who are in the communities directly affected, and then you're also talking about how some policies are, you mentioned ABC, are out of touch with the realities on the ground. How do you think it's possible to engage those communities who are directly affected in the advocacy process, in the policymaking process, to make those policies more effective and more coherent?
Professor Hausman reminded me of a survey that was done by the, thanks for your question, of a survey that was done by the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the Human Sciences Research Council. And that survey showed that the people most affected by the epidemic are women in informal settlements and young men in informal settlements. There's a brilliant PhD thesis by a young chap from America called Mark Hunter, who showed that young women very often have multiple sexual partners, not because they want to, but because they need to. And so the question has to be for us, yes, to make, our government did a brilliant job in making condoms available. 1 million condoms the apartheid government gave out, 350 million male condoms the South African government gave out last year, 4 million female condoms. The problem with that is it's still only 35 condoms per sexually active males per year, so access to condoms is still seriously limited. The question for us is, it can't simply be condoms. It has to be the scaling up of condoms, but yes, access to housing without having to pay for it through sexual favors, access to social security for women and young men has to be combined with that. So HIV has to be treated as an emergency, a humanitarian emergency, the prevention and the treatment, but it also has to be treated, as is the topic of this conference, in its development agenda of giving everyone a decent life.
Hi, I'm Joe Wright, a medical student here, and also briefly honored to have been a TAC volunteer. Before I ask my question, I also want to say that the Senate right now is sort of stalling on a bill called H4176, which would give syringe access through pharmacies and would be a really, really important HIV prevention tool in Massachusetts, which is one of only 3 states in the nation that doesn't have this policy. So I hope that I honor your example by bringing that up, and you can go to the AIDS Action Committee website to find out more about how to pressure your senator to move this HIV prevention legislation here in Massachusetts. In terms of South Africa, there's been a lot of talk about how to sort of make adherence to antiretrovirals work as things are scaled up. And I know that in Cape Town there are several different models of how to do that. One of sort of having professional people come around and check on whether you've taken your medicines and sort of chat with you about that, just sort of the tuberculosis model. And then the MSF model of kind of treatment partners designating your girlfriend or your sister or somebody close to you to sort of help you with adherence. And I'm wondering about what your, whether those 2 approaches or others, what your membership has been feeling about how to make adherence work in a way that is friendly to people with AIDS.
I think HIV, Joe, thank you for the comment. The HIV is, for all of us, a very, very different disease, and it's changed how all of us look at public health. Whether it's the Treatment Action Group in New York, whether it's Project Inform on your West Coast, I prefer the East Coast, sorry. But whether it's those organizations, all of them made it very clear that central to the treatment of any illness, not simply HIV, has to be the education, the self-education, the autonomy of the people who have to take the medicines. And we promote what we call treatment literacy, and it will take a long time to explain, but essentially it is making sure that every person has, whether through song, through posters, through workshops that we work with, have access to information on how to take their medicines. So to rely on yourself first and foremost. I remember when I started my own medication, my boyfriend had to do my treatment support. He forgot more often than I did, and once he even took my pills because it looked like headache pills. So he swallowed even once, even though he's HIV negative. He had a terrible headache, a worse headache afterwards. But essentially, the real question is that you have to educate the person who's ill themselves to be able to take control of their own health and be able to look after themselves, because otherwise it's policing, and policing never works.
He's up there.
Hello. One of the interesting things about HIV, of course, is that it exposes a lot of inequalities in society, of class, of gender, of sexuality. Basically, the more marginalized a group is, the more they get affected by the disease. And so in addressing it, the call to address it involves a call to do away with barriers to reducing inequality, right? And that ends up being a more radical move than most people, especially many students whom I've spoken to at Harvard, are willing to do, because it involves a large amount of change. Specifically with respect to healthcare, a lot of people feel more passionately about intellectual property rights being protected than about money being given for universal healthcare. And so I wondered if you could personally, as somebody who's been active in this field, talk a little bit about a nuanced design of intellectual property rights, because I think that is the field that most people here are equipped to attack or to deal with, such that it provides for both healthcare that is fair to people who are suffering, who are lower class or oppressed in many other ways, and have to deal with the AIDS issue while still protecting the intellectual property rights that so many people here care about.
I think the most important rights we have are the rights to life, to dignity and so on, and healthcare access. But I also, and Treatment Action Campaign has always said that, and sometimes we've had a difference with many of our colleagues, that the right to intellectual property should be respected. And that right is important. However, we believe the patent system is the wrong way to do it in relation to medicine. And we want to appeal to people here at Harvard. I'm sure there's one or two people with brains here who can help. But essentially the question has to be this, that the patent system is monopoly. It's just simply monopoly. And if you, a social democrat like me who accepts a combination of the market and of the state being responsible for certain public goods like health, education, and transport, but that you should still have a very strong and thriving private sector. If you like me, then the point you have to ask yourself is, what type of system do we need to protect intellectual property rights? And for me, that means very simply, one that encourages competition, the greatest one that encourages competition and brings as many medicines to the market as possible. Now, for me, I think one must never expect of people more than they can deliver. So, for instance, to expect Harvard to march against privatization would be a huge mistake. You'd only end up in deep self-disappointment, not in achieving anti-privatization. So, I think there are many Harvard students, and I think those of us who are serious human rights activists, we've made the biggest mistake of simply relying on the touchy-feely human rights issues like the right to dignity, equality, and so on. We haven't done contract, private law, studied them to be able to take advantage of the rules and the systems that exist to make property and above all public goods more accessible for everyone, whether it's water, whether it's anything.
Please.
I'm a political activist myself, and I'm a supporter of the Revolutionary Communist Party action in this area. But to get deeper into this question of the structural barriers, as one example, like they estimate 1 billion people in the world today trying to get by under $2 a day. So who has power in today's world? Doesn't that reflect this whole discourse? And I mean, I think it needs to be debated here at Harvard as well. But I think the bigger question is this whole underlying structure of the free market and global capitalism today, what it's doing to humanity, and the prospect actually of even worse, and even the possibility of extinction of the human race because of all these bigger questions of consuming resources, global warming, all interconnect in the sense of what kind of scenario is being projected for humanity. I think we need to get back to this debate, what socialism has done when it's been in power, and the prospect of a society that isn't geared toward the market entirely. This is what I want to try to project, even into the Harvard audience that
has its entrenched interest, but I think people really want to pursue what's going to represent hope for humanity. It's so much bigger than this institution, actually.
I think that is a comment, and I used to be a Trotskyist in my youth, and I think I learned many valuable things from Trotskyism, but I think that there's an enormous possibilities, even in current society, that reforms that we're not pursuing, because very often we are looking at the revolutionary project as our only way forward. But I believe that it's possible to lift many, many, many millions, if not billions of people out of poverty if we utilize a combination of the state and the market. And the question has to be for all of us, what balance do we need to strike? In South Africa, a country where you have close to 40% unemployment, if you take the expanded definition of employment, the question has to be that the state has to be a greater deal, a developmental state, but not technocratic in that sense, but a state that relies on people's action and support to assist it, to fight entrenched interests, whether it's land ownership, whether it is any number of things, to ensure that there's greater access, but also to create a place where the smallest businesses can thrive. Because at the moment, in South Africa as an example, many people will say labor is overprotected. Now that's nonsense. The real problem to small business is actually big businesses not giving them money, them not having access to any range of things from licensing, not being able to license their businesses, and so on. The costs of that are far greater than the costs of labor and so on. So it's a long speech that I'm making.
I am Peggy Sikakane, an educator from Dundee, KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I would like to know what is an alternative way of protecting the 15 and 19-year-olds in high schools? Because recently, Nalendi Pandor, the National Minister of Education in South Africa, announced that the condom supply should be stopped in schools. So those boys and girls who are sexually active, how can we protect them?
I think that is, Becky, I want to say thank you. And it's one of the most important questions for all of us. The Microbicides International Conference is taking place in Cape Town this year. And we want to ask everyone here to endorse TAC's demands. We go to our website, you'll find us, TAC, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, the Chris Hani Institute, the Rural Action Development, Research Action Development, something, Radar. A good group of people, Radar, fantastic group of people from Limpopo. We're bringing people together to discuss prevention advocacy because TAC has done a lot of work on prevention on a day-to-day basis, explaining to people how to use condoms, distributing condoms. We've never done prevention advocacy except on mother-to-child prevention. And all of us have a duty to deal with what is the greatest crisis, and that is prevention. There should be condoms in every mosque, church, temple. Every shul should have condoms. It is the duty, the moral duty of religious leaders to destigmatize condoms. Condoms are stigmatized, and we have to destigmatize them. And more importantly, we have to have them in schools. I've just pointed to you that every school in South Africa, especially high schools, have a learner who has HIV. Every school has 10% of its teachers who have HIV. So it's important for us to ensure that there are condoms in those schools.
Zaki, I grew up in Habonimdro in South Africa, and I know that every time you've spoken, it's been an absolute inspiration, and I want to thank you so much for that. I wonder if you could speak to the issue of traditional healers in South Africa and the role that they play in both prevention and, in certain instances, causing the pandemic to expand. And if you could address that for us, it would be great. Thank you.
I think maybe he's been planted to ask a sweetheart question by someone. I want to say this about TAC. TAC is one of the few places where you can find positive Muslims in Habonimdro. A Zionist organization and a pro-Palestinian organization in the same place. And I think it's very important because one of the greatest obstacles for all of our prevention work is religious fundamentalisms of all kind, whether that of George Bush, whether that of the Pakistani ulama, whether that of the Iranian president, whether that of the right in Israel or of the BJP in India. All forms of religious fundamentalism undermine the autonomy of every individual, but particularly of women and young people. And so it's important for us to stand firm on that. And TAC is one place where you can find people, irrespective of religious belief, cooperating, both with deep respect for people with religious beliefs and the few of us, a minority who are atheists, can work in cooperation. But simply to say this about traditional healers, there's a whole issue which Aaron Choa worked on. He's a Harvard, what do you call them, seniors or graduating students. He's going to work for the Clinton Foundation. And Clinton, like all people, is only good after they're out of office. Only presidents are always good when they're out of office. So the thing about, there's a really remarkable movement in South Africa at the moment in which our government is misusing traditional healers and people's use of traditional healing to undermine science and to undermine HIV science in particular. Now, for me, that undermines traditional medicine even further, because the recognition that we have to give to traditional medicine is first and foremost, a traditional healer wrote a piece for TAC or was interviewed and said, we want TAC to help us learn to write, because in that way we can have prescriptions and we can write prescriptions and we could write letters, referral letters to primary healthcare clinics. At the moment, we have to take our patients to the healthcare clinics. That's just an example of the fact that we need to find ways of allowing traditional healers to enter the system of healthcare that allows them to be educated, to use modern communication and so on, so that the good parts of traditional healing can be strengthened. The second thing is the protection of the intellectual property rights of traditional healers. That is a vexed question, but we firmly believe that it can be done. Because at the moment, what you have is one or two traditional healers teaming up with one or two vitamin salesmen and pharmaceutical companies and running off and patenting particular things. Whereas it needs to be community-based property recognition of intellectual property rights, and community, the community needs to benefit in some way directly from the investment into and the research of traditional healers' intellectual property rights, and they themselves need to receive that. For all of us, many of you will have heard that based on the denialism, there's a strange chap called Matthias Rath, who's a German-American, who claims that his medicines, not his medicines, well, they are medicines, but his vitamins can cure bird flu. And that form of quackery raised itself in Harper's Magazine through an article on AIDS denialism there. And I really want to appeal to everyone here in the audience who's a scientist. For too long have we allowed our science to remain within the academic institutions without it becoming the property of every citizen. There's a deep scientific illiteracy among all of us, which is being exploited by quacks and people who profiteer from people's vulnerability. And we need to find ways of stopping that.
Our final question of the night.
Thank you. My name's Katie Krause, and I'm with the AIDS Policy Project and with Physicians for Human Rights. And I want to thank the students for bringing Zaki here, and thank Zaki for speaking. My question is, as a number of countries debate the idea of doing very widespread, huge numbers of people HIV testing, there are inherent ethical concerns about whether or not that testing is coerced and the effect of that testing, whether routine testing, which is the term that's used, means that you get to choose whether you opt in to get tested or have to opt out to get tested, and the implications for whether or not people will be able to get treatment or counseling or anything after they test positive. And there's a big debate right now going on in American activist communities about the ethics of these issues. I wanted to know what your views are. Thank you.
That one is a difficult one, Katie, and it's good to see you. For me, the difficulty is this. if I had taken Ronald Lowe, when I said to him, Ronald, you're losing weight, you're sick all the time, why don't you go for an HIV test? And he said to me, no, I don't think I have HIV, don't worry. If I had taken him by his hand, he would still be alive today. And I'm not beating up on myself. What I'm saying is that it's a very, very difficult question, and there's no simple answer. Traditional public health forcing of people to do anything will not work. And for me, opt-out is critical only in the context where you can provide treatment. And it should only, and by treatment I don't simply mean antiretroviral treatment, but where you have TB treatment available, where you have prevention of, where you have cotrimoxazole available, any number of things. So it's a very difficult question, and there's no position. In fact, our organization split on it. I'm on the side that says we must test people, and we must encourage and encourage the routinization of testing. So when you go just simply to have your teeth looked at, you should be offered an HIV test. And if you test positive, you should be told what treatment is available and where to get it. Or even before you test positive, you need to know that. But I think it's complex for each society, and I think it's a discussion that is urgent and needs to be had now.
Thank you very much, Zaki, for a very, very enlightening presentation. Let me ask Maria Musmanzia to come and give us instructions or marching orders as to what comes ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaki, for another invigorating session. This marks the start of the 12th Annual International Development Conference at Harvard. A couple of logistical announcements. We have, as most of the registrants know, a reception at the MIT Museum. Shuttles are waiting in the courtyard outside to take you to the MIT reception area, and maps, etc., are available at the registration desk if you, and also the registrants have them in your booklet that you received in the folders. Also, we have a documentary, ABC Africa, by Abbas Kiarostami, showing in the Wiener Auditorium, and Mr. Jean Schut will be introducing the movie. The documentary is open to the public, so even if you have not registered for the conference, you can still catch the movie. It starts at 6, and the MIT reception is also scheduled from 6 to 8 p.m. Thank you very much to all of you for coming, and thank you so much, Zaki, for your presence, and thank you, Professor Hausman, for introducing the conference. Thank you very much.